In this episode, we take the final step that separates organizations that merely survive incidents from organizations that truly mature, turning what happened into lasting improvement. Lessons learned is often the first activity to get skipped because people are exhausted, embarrassed, or eager to return to normal, yet skipping it is how the same failure repeats with a new date on the calendar. Operationalizing lessons learned means you treat the incident as data about how your security program actually behaves under pressure, not as a story you tell once and then forget. That data includes technical gaps, process gaps, communication gaps, and governance gaps, and it often reveals that the most important problems were not the flashy attacker tricks, but the everyday weak points that made detection slow or response chaotic. Leaders are responsible for turning those discoveries into changes that stick, because improvement does not happen by goodwill alone. When you do this well, the real output of an incident is reduced recurrence, faster response next time, and stronger trust across the business. The first discipline is framing what lessons learned is and what it is not, because beginners often confuse it with blame, and blame shuts down honest analysis. Lessons learned is a structured review of what happened, how it was handled, what worked, what failed, and what needs to change, with the goal of improving future outcomes. It is not a courtroom, and it is not a therapy session, even though emotions will exist and need respect. A mature approach uses evidence, timelines, and observations rather than impressions, because impressions often reflect stress and partial information. Leaders should set expectations that the goal is system improvement, which includes people, processes, and technology, not just one patch or one policy. This framing makes it easier for teams to speak truthfully about what slowed them down, where authority was unclear, or where tooling failed, without fear of punishment. When people feel safe to be honest, the organization learns faster, and learning is the only reliable way to reduce recurrence. A strong lessons learned process begins with a reliable incident narrative, because you cannot improve what you cannot describe accurately. That narrative is built from the incident timeline, the evidence preserved during response, and the decisions recorded along the way. Beginners sometimes try to summarize incidents from memory, but memory is unreliable under stress and becomes biased by what people wish had happened. Leaders should insist that lessons learned starts from documented facts. When the first signal appeared, when the incident was declared, when containment actions occurred, what systems were affected, and what verification showed during recovery. The timeline is not just for historians. It reveals delays, handoff problems, and decision bottlenecks that are invisible when you only look at the final outcome. It also helps separate detection time from response time, because an incident can be slow to detect even if the team responds quickly once alerted. Understanding those differences helps you target improvements accurately rather than applying generic fixes. After the narrative is established, the next step is identifying contributing factors in a way that recognizes complexity. A single root cause is a comforting idea, but many incidents involve a chain of conditions, like weak access controls combined with incomplete logging combined with delayed patching and unclear ownership. If you fix only one link, another link can still lead to a similar incident. Leaders should encourage analysis that distinguishes between the entry point, the enabling conditions, the detection gaps, and the response friction. The entry point explains how the attacker gained access. The enabling conditions explain why that access led to wider harm. Detection gaps explain why the organization did not notice sooner, and response friction explains why containment and recovery took the time they did. This structured thinking prevents lessons learned from becoming a shallow list of obvious statements like "we need better security." It also helps teams propose improvements that are precise, testable, and assignable. Contributing factor analysis turns an incident from a scary story into a map of what to fix. Operationalizing lessons learned means converting observations into program improvements, and that conversion requires discipline because many good ideas die when no one owns them. An observation is a statement like "we did not have clear authority to isolate the identity system," while an improvement is a specific change like establishing an emergency change authority and documenting isolation decision rights with executive approval. Leaders should ensure that each improvement has an owner, a timeline, and a success measure, because without those, improvements remain aspirations. The success measure is important because it prevents busy work and it allows leadership to know whether the program actually became stronger. For example, a success measure might be that incident response contacts are updated quarterly and tested, or that critical logs are centrally collected with a defined retention period, or that key system access reviews occur on a fixed cadence. Beginners sometimes fear adding accountability will create blame, but accountability for improvements is different from blame for incidents. Accountability means the organization takes the lesson seriously enough to change, and that is how recurrence is reduced. One major category of lessons learned is detection and visibility, because many incidents become severe only because they are detected late. Improvements here often include better logging coverage, more useful alerting, and clearer signal-to-noise management so responders can trust what they see. Leaders should focus on making detection decision-ready, meaning alerts should point to actionable risk rather than to vague anomalies that create constant fatigue. That can involve aligning monitoring to high-risk assets and high-risk actions, such as unusual privilege changes, suspicious authentication patterns, or unexpected outbound connections from sensitive environments. Visibility improvements also include ensuring that logs are protected from tampering and retained long enough to support investigations. Beginners sometimes believe adding more alerts equals better security, but too many low-quality alerts can make the organization less safe because real warnings get ignored. The goal is higher quality visibility that supports faster triage and clearer scope assessment. When detection improves, the organization can contain earlier, which reduces the total damage even if attacks still occur. Another category is response process improvements, because response quality depends on clear roles, practiced workflows, and decision rights that function under stress. Lessons learned often reveal that the technical team was capable, but coordination was weak, such as confusion over who could approve downtime, who contacted legal, or how to communicate with executives. Leaders should convert these findings into concrete process changes, like refining incident classification criteria, updating playbooks for common scenarios, defining escalation paths, and rehearsing tabletop exercises that stress communications and decision-making. Process improvements also include establishing a reliable incident timeline practice and ensuring evidence handling procedures are known and followed. Beginners sometimes treat playbooks as paperwork, but playbooks are memory aids for high-stress moments, and they prevent improvisation from becoming chaos. A mature program also considers staffing and fatigue, because long incidents reveal the need for shift handoffs and role redundancy. When response processes are improved, the next incident is less likely to spiral, even if the attacker is skilled. Technical improvements are often the most visible outcomes, but leaders must ensure they are not the only outcomes. Technical improvements can include patch management changes, configuration hardening, segmentation adjustments, identity and access control tightening, and better key management or certificate validation depending on the incident. These changes matter because they reduce attacker opportunity, but they must be implemented in a way that is sustainable, otherwise teams will bypass them under operational pressure. Leaders should push for changes that address the enabling conditions revealed by the incident, not just the visible symptoms. For example, if the incident spread because of overly broad privileges, the improvement is not just cleaning malware, it is redesigning access so lateral movement is harder. If the incident persisted because credentials were not rotated, the improvement includes key and credential lifecycle discipline. Technical improvements should also include verification steps, because unverified fixes create false confidence. Sustainable technical improvement is not a patch note. It is a measurable reduction in reachable risk. Communication and stakeholder management often generate lessons that are as important as technical fixes, because poorly coordinated communication can magnify harm and slow response. Lessons learned might reveal that executives received inconsistent updates, that customer support lacked accurate scripts, or that legal review slowed urgent messages due to unclear processes. Leaders should convert these findings into communication playbooks, message templates, defined update cadences, and clear approval paths that can function during crises. Communication improvements also include identifying which stakeholders must be notified under which conditions, and ensuring contact information and escalation methods are current. Beginners sometimes assume communication is common sense, but in incidents, common sense is vulnerable to stress and rumor. A rehearsed communication plan keeps the organization calm, reduces uncoordinated actions, and supports trust. It also protects responders from constant interruptions by setting expectations for when updates will occur. When communications are improved, the incident response team can focus, and stakeholders can make better business decisions. Operationalizing lessons learned also requires integrating improvements into the program's governance mechanisms, because changes that live outside governance often fade. That means updating policies, standards, and procedures so the new behavior becomes the default expectation rather than a heroic one-time effort. It also means ensuring training reflects the lessons, because new team members will not inherit lessons through osmosis. Leaders should treat training as a way to encode improvements into muscle memory, especially for triage, evidence preservation, and containment decisions that require calm judgment. Governance integration also includes audits and reviews that verify the improvements remain in place months later. Beginners sometimes assume that once a change is made, it stays, but organizations drift, and drift reintroduces risk quietly. When improvements are embedded in governance, the program becomes resilient to turnover and time. That resilience is the true output of lessons learned. Measuring reduced recurrence is tricky because you cannot rely on the absence of incidents as proof of improvement, since you may simply be lucky or blind. A better approach is to measure leading indicators that reflect stronger controls and stronger readiness. Examples of leading indicators include improved coverage of critical logs, reduced time to detect suspicious activity, faster triage classification, clearer escalation, and improved patch or configuration compliance on key assets. Leaders should insist on measurement because it turns lessons learned into a program management activity rather than an emotional response. Measurement also helps prioritize because not every improvement can be completed immediately, and you need to invest where risk reduction is greatest. Beginners sometimes resist measurement because it feels like bureaucracy, but without measurement, improvements compete poorly against daily operational work and get postponed indefinitely. When improvements are measured, progress becomes visible, and leadership can reinforce it through resources and attention. Visibility is a force multiplier for follow-through. A critical leadership challenge is balancing the desire for sweeping reform with the need for practical change that teams can actually implement. After a painful incident, organizations often feel the urge to overhaul everything, but overly broad plans can collapse under their own weight. A more effective approach is to choose a focused set of high-impact improvements, implement them, verify them, and then expand from there. Leaders should frame this as a backlog of improvements with clear prioritization, not as a single massive project that must be completed before the organization can breathe. This approach reduces burnout and increases the chance that improvements stick. It also supports learning because each implemented change provides feedback about what worked and what created new friction. Beginners sometimes think smaller steps mean weaker response, but in program management, smaller verified steps often produce more durable progress than grand statements. Operationalizing lessons learned is about building a program that steadily improves, not about making a dramatic promise. As you bring the process to completion, it helps to recognize that lessons learned is also a cultural moment where the organization decides what kind of security program it wants to be. If leadership treats the incident as a temporary embarrassment and moves on, the culture learns to hide problems and avoid honest reporting. If leadership treats the incident as data and invests in improvement without scapegoating, the culture learns that transparency and discipline are valued. That cultural lesson affects future detection and response because people are more likely to report anomalies, follow procedures, and participate in exercises when they trust leadership's intent. Reduced recurrence is therefore partly a technical outcome and partly a cultural outcome, and leadership influences both. When people believe that reporting issues leads to improvement rather than punishment, visibility increases and response improves. Culture is not vague here. It shapes whether the program can learn and adapt. By the end of this episode, you should be able to describe operationalized lessons learned as a conversion process. Evidence and timelines become insights. Insights become owned improvements. Improvements become measured changes in the program, and those changes reduce the chance and impact of recurrence. The work includes technical fixes, process refinement, communication improvements, governance updates, training, and measurement, all tied back to what the incident actually revealed. The biggest danger is letting fatigue or discomfort cut the loop short, because an unlearned incident is an invitation for repetition. Leaders close the loop by insisting on ownership, verification, and integration, so the program evolves rather than resets. When that loop is healthy, each incident, while still painful, becomes an investment in future resilience rather than a recurring nightmare. That is what mature security leadership looks like, turning disruption into durable improvement and turning lessons into a safer, steadier organization.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.